Hello, everyone, and welcome to Singularity One-on-One. Singularity One-on-One is a podcast feature of Singularity weblog where you can go and listen to it or download it in full. As you may already know, my name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and as always, I will be the man with the questions. Today, I'm privileged to have Brian Malow on the show. Brian Malow is a science comedian based in San Francisco who has performed for the American Chemical Society, the National Association of Science Writers, Apple, Dell, NASA, and a number of other acronyms. He produces science videos for Time Magazine's website and audio essays for Neil deGrasse Tyson's radio show. Brian has led workshops and given presentations to train scientists to become better speakers for the National Science Foundation, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the National Research Council of Canada. So, without further ado, hi, hi Brian, and welcome to Singularity One-on-One.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Unfortunately, we don't have a brew on the show, but perhaps that's not a bad idea.
Well, I have a glass for a brew. It's Newcastle, but it's filled with water, the original beverage.
Oh, there we go.
Let that be our sponsor today, water, from the makers of air.
Fantastic. Okay. So let's start our interview by asking you this, Brian. Why call yourself science comedian? I mean, science is usually perceived to be a very serious thing, and comedy is quite the opposite. At least good comedy is quite the opposite. So is there any contradiction here?
Well, I don't think so. But boy, you said a lot of interesting things in a short time there. I think comedy can be a serious thing, but that's almost an entirely different issue, because certainly a lot of comedians attack very important subjects, and we have social commentators. You know, some comedians might be more like clowns and entertainers, and I wouldn't even downplay the importance of that, of just entertaining and making people smile and laugh. But certainly a lot of our best comedians do a little more than that. They're social commentators. They're, they have political opinions that they're vocal about. So it can be a serious topic, science and comedy. I mean, seriousness and comedy. But why I call myself a science comedian? Actually, it's because I was just already doing it. I started out as a comedian. I didn't have a qualifier on that. I was just doing it the way everyone else does it. But because I've always loved science and been a geek, it informed the kind of comedy I did. So right from the beginning, mixed in with other stuff, as I was trying to find my own voice, as all artists do, I was really doing a lot of science comedy. It was always fun for me and most interesting to me to make science references, to attack certain weird topics that maybe were a little sciencey. And so that kind of stuff always informed my comedy. And it took a lot of years. It took a decade and a half or more before I realized, some of my favorite jokes I wasn't doing all the time in nightclubs, because I perform mostly at nightclubs, colleges, and private events. And what would happen is sometimes I got private gigs for like Apple or Dell or Microsoft, and there would be a bunch of engineers in the room, and I would pull out some obscure science references that I wasn't doing for. And believe me, in nightclubs, I was doing a somewhat geeky act. But certain jokes, they just didn't get the laugh I wanted. Certain jokes had a little science, but they were okay for everyone. Like, I used to be an astronomer, but I got stuck on the day shift, which sucks. Like that kind of line, that's for anybody. It doesn't even have to be for a science comedian. Anyone could have written that joke. And it's just that I had a lot of stuff like that had a science flavor to it, but it was fine for nightclub audiences or colleges. But then there were always these jokes that didn't quite hit as hard as I expected them to or wanted them to. And I realized I have to get my audience. I had to get the adenine to my thymine, the guanine to my cytosine, the complementary audience to my brand of comedy. So the comedy that I wanted to do. So it was really a very natural evolution. at some point I realized, hey, I should just call it science comedy. And I went and looked to see if sciencecomedian.com was available several years ago, which, if you know anything about domain names, it's hard to just take two words and hope that the domain is still available. Most of that real estate is long gone. So when I found that sciencecomedian.com was available, I didn't know if that was a really good sign or a really bad sign. Maybe it's undesirable real estate. It's useless. But it turned out that it was a good idea. And a lot of good stuff has followed from that decision to call it science comedy and to focus on it.
Fantastic. I personally love the title. I think it's very unique. I think it's very original, and I think it's also very deep. So it's got the elements that you were mentioning about serious and comedy. So I think it's brilliant personally.
It's funny. My old sorry to interrupt you, but the old domain that I used to use also had that suggestion in it. It was butseriously.com, which I still own, but seriously, it suggests the seriousness and it also suggests comedy. So that's the realm that I've always enjoyed working in. I like serious stuff, and science in particular, and interesting books and thoughts and films, but I also love humor. Yeah. And so wherever I can mix those two, that's the intersection that I like to be at.
I mean, it's not hard to see that you love what you do. So that always makes me happy to see people doing what they love. And by the way, my wife has a circus company, which I am helping with whenever needed. So I do have some experience, and I know how you do have to match your gigs to your audience in order to evoke a certain response, and that's indeed a very, very important element. And it shows true professionalism when you're able to judge your audience and adapt to it in the best way possible.
Yeah, comedians have to do that on the fly quite often. You start down a path and you go, you know what? This audience just isn't into this. I've misjudged. I prejudged them incorrectly, and maybe we'll give them a little of this and see how they like it.
So let me ask you this then: is there any tension at all between science and comedy when you step on the stage? In other words, can you? I mean, I can see how on the one hand, if you're too serious, you're not gonna make them laugh. On the other hand, if you have the geeky audience, like you mentioned, the engineers at Apple or Dell or something, and you're too, I don't know, not serious, then you can't also make them laugh. And I mean, is there a balance there that you find, or how do you do it?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting issue because I do run into those things. I perform for all sorts of audiences. So I get general audiences, maybe at a comedy club. And actually, that's a mix. Anyone could be there. Science teachers, scientists, science students, and then just general audience that's like me, just an enthusiast. Although I say I was an astronomer that got stuck on the day shift, I was never actually a scientist. But you're right. People have a lot of expectations, and I know that some people, when they hear science comedian, I mean, the two main ones are they're either very psyched about the idea. Oh, science comedian. I love it. Yes. Two things I like, science and comedy. Why not a science comedian? But I think some other people have been ruined we've seen bad examples of science and comedy mixing very poorly in the past. And maybe it wasn't a professional comedian. I like to think that, the path I took is I was a professional comedian first. And then I focused on science. So I took the skills as a professional comedian and focused them on the realm of science. But I think that in the past, we've seen people that are scientists being funny. And believe me, I have a high opinion of the sense of humor of scientists, and I want to address this stereotype. But I think we have all seen bad examples of someone who wasn't really a comedian and maybe didn't have a sense of humor or much of one, and that what passed for science comedy in the past, maybe the bar was set pretty low, and some people don't even think that it's going to be funny. And then there's what you said, which is people come, they want to be entertained, but if there's something I could say about the sense of humor of some scientists, sometimes it's very literal, so that you not only have to be funny, but boy, they don't cut you much leeway sometimes because they're geeks. Because and I say that as a geek is that here's an example of I can't laugh at just anything. I remember when the B-1B bombers first came out, the stealth bombers, and there was a very common joke that I hated.
I think the B1s were the Lancers, actually, and the B2 is the stealth one.
Oh, the B2. Okay, sorry. The B2 then. The stealth bomber, there was this joke that I disliked for two reasons. One is that if you hear it from a lot of different people, then it's hacky, and we've heard it. But I never could get past the flawed premise. The joke was, hey, the B2, the stealth bomber, they say it's invisible. Why don't we just say we built a bunch of them? Because it's invisible. And to me, I could never really laugh at that because they never said it was invisible. It's supposed to be invisible to radar. And I could never. So that's the kind of geekiness in me where I'm like, well, the premise is too flawed for me to go with you to the punchline. So karmically, I guess, I get a lot of that because the audience that I want, the ones that would appreciate the subjects that I want to talk about and the references I want to rely on as punchlines, they're the kind of people that will pick apart any little flaw in it. So, I mean, I have a bit about a science issue in Star Wars, about the parsec issue. A lot of people are familiar with it. You haven't heard of the Millennium Falcon. It's the ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. And a parsec's not a unit of time. It's a unit of distance. But so I would have thought, I love Star Wars. I'm not mocking the movie or George Lucas. It's an important part of my childhood. I love the movie, but I like poking fun at this little science error in it. And I have a pretty funny little spiel on it, I think. But boy, the Star Wars fans had no sense of humor about it. And I would have thought they would have loved it because it's like, hey, at least I'm a comedian talking about Star Wars. But they took it too seriously and they felt like I was attacking, even though I made it clear that I love the thing. But yeah, in the science realm, there's another joke where I talked about the heat in Arizona. And one time in a room where there were a bunch of scientists, it was 125 degrees. And I said, wow, that just sounds like science fiction. You're talking about the surface of Venus. And in the back of the room, someone yelled out, no, Venus is much hotter than that. And I knew that, but I was using a comedic device called exaggeration. Yeah. So my point there is just that it's kind of funny. It's like I need to be able to use exaggeration and I need to be able to stretch the truth a little. But when you're talking to geeks, sometimes they'll harp on you for that. And it's pretty hard to be funny and stick to absolute literal truth and not use any of these other tools of humor.
Yeah, and that's why it's such an amazing accomplishment, because I think the best jokes are also very smart at the same time while being funny. And that's why it's such an accomplishment.
And to have a little truth in there. Yeah,
exactly.
I do like to stick. I don't want to give out any misinformation. I do want my stuff to be scientifically accurate to the extent and mathematically accurate to the extent that it makes sense.
And especially since you mentioned the serious point that comedy tries to make, then it's really hard to get that, to make them think that effect while at the same time making them laugh. That's a real accomplishment.